Hello, and thank you for joining us. On behalf of SimSpace and Carahsoft, I'd like to welcome you to our SimSpace webinar, Launching the Next Generation of Cybersecurity Education. At this time, I would like to introduce our speakers today. For today, we have Graham Westbrook, Susan Green, and Jason Rivera. The floor is yours.
Excellent. Thanks, Hannah. I'm glad to be here. Afternoon. Appreciate you joining for today. I'm going to share my screen, and today we're going to talk a lot about simulations. Hannah mentioned that largely this is kind of the future of the way in which we're approaching workforce development. And we have to stay ahead of the curve. We have to be the ones who are considering what's new, what's next, not simply how to, train like we train and do documents and reports sort of old school. We need to consider how are our threats continuing to evolve, and can we train against those threats in realistic lookalike environments? So today we're going to talk about SimSpace. We are going to introduce the concept of cyber range simulations. We'll further discuss some potential use cases today, as well as new and emerging use cases across change management, to include things like the recent CrowdStrike kind of Delta software update situation, as well as another use case on strengthening cloud security in a hybrid workforce and how those kind of cloud augmentations could introduce new security risks. And the use case three, enhancing cybersecurity risk decision making and driving down our cyber insurance premiums by continuing to train like we fight and develop meaningful progress with our workforce to sort of prove that we're better at identifying bad. So jumping straight in here, SimSpace, exactly as it sounds, it's a simulation space where we can build replica lookalike networks that are similar to the organization that you may be coming from. This was founded in 2015 by a fighter pilot, also a key leader at US Cyber Command, and a scientist and group leader from MIT Lincoln Lab. So this kind of confluence of different worlds creates this very interesting future simulation ability. We also have a very large, probably the world's largest cyber range implementation with US Cyber Command, work with a number of the top US banks, the Five Eyes intelligence community and allied governments and militaries globally, and create the highest fidelity, most sophisticated customizable simulation environments in the world. A number of the applications that you may be used to, right? The endpoints, the vulnerability management tools, the kind of policy tools, the things that you would expect to use in your existing security stack are things that we can also pull into a SimSpace cyber range. So anything that can be virtualized can be added to a range. So as you're thinking about this, this isn't something sort of like abstract and theoretical. This is, you want to use your tools? Great, let's put those in because we need to learn how to train realistically. We also support a number of organizations globally, and while our heavy focus is North America and allied governments, there are a number of international organizations that we've also interacted with. Next, I'd like to introduce the concept of cyber range simulations a little bit more deeply. So as an example, these are just a few use cases to get you thinking, right? Just get the initial juices flowing. We are able to construct an environment where we could consider environmental science or urban planning, education and training, various engineering, military compounds, fuel farm simulations, airfields, satellites, you name it, and we can simulate it. And it's important that, our as we develop our workforce and as we think about upskilling and training, that we are thinking about global problems, not training for sort of the past, but preparing for the next threat. Jason, maybe, if you could jump in here, there's probably some additional use cases you'd want to foot stomp.
Yeah, for me, the idea that comes to mind, whether you're a student or a cybersecurity professional, is really this idea of preparedness for the future, right? And so if you're a cybersecurity professional, wouldn't it be nice if you could simulate certain scenarios to where you know that you're making the best decisions? Likewise, if you're a student and you're wondering, like, okay, how am I going to fit into the workforce? how am I actually going to know what this is going to be like? But wouldn't it be nice to be able to simulate that situation and actually be able to experience it in real life? And really, for me, that's kind of the crux of this. It allows people to experience things, whether they be threats or whether they be certain scenarios that they might encounter in the future, in a safe way, so that you can be better prepared when that situation actually does arise in the future.
That's really important. And I also think it's important that we differentiate between a production environment and a non-production environment. There are tools out there like breach and attack simulators, otherwise known as BAS, that are largely production, defanged, and agent-based. SimSpace, on the other hand, is non-production in a cyber range, agentless, and destructive on purpose. Because if we create a lookalike environment, we can actually do more things like reality without having to worry about whether or not something is going to actually crash, or worry about actually taking down the production domain controller. It's important for us to create that kind of lookalike environment and bring in realistic threats and adversaries into that range environment. All right. Moving on to the next component here, let's discuss a simulator and a cyber range in layers. So direct your attention to the bottom of the screen where we have this kind of network architecture layer. If you think about it, this is the real world emulation. And this is where we're able to produce those kind of IT, cloud, OT, even IoT kind of test bed and network architectures. So think about the actual sort of technologies, the network topologies, and how everything kind of connects and plugs in together. From here, we can even tie in real systems. So if you think about a legacy mainframe or an OT ICS SCADA device, like a water treatment facility, some organizations, and actually most organizations, cannot simulate for a bad day in cyber, or sort of that most severe day against that water treatment plant, for example. We can, by plugging into that human machine interface or that programmable logical controller and attaching that into this network architecture. There's kind of layers of fidelity there too. If we wanted to do a virtualization or a simulation, we certainly could. But if you want to pull in the real thing because it can't be virtualized, we can accommodate that as well. The next layer up is where we get into the security stack. Simply, this is your security tools, the applications that you're used to using. So think CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, Palo, various application security tools, WAFs, SIEMs, SOARs, cloud, you name it, we can plug it in. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, that we haven't come across something that we haven't been able to pull into this kind of range environment. And again, very important to create the kind of complexity that mirrors the complexity in a production network. The layer up from here is where we get into the realistic activity. So now that we have the test bed and now that we have your tools, now we need the activity that's kind of running across the network. Said otherwise, if we dropped in a piece of malware in here and there was no kind of user emulation or anything, it would just, the logs would immediately point to the malicious activity and all of the logs would be malicious. But what we do is generate user emulation that mimics how users are logging on and off of their devices, sending messages to each other, creating PowerPoints, browsing the web, browsing Pastebin, downloading things from a simulated internet. And we're doing that within this environment to generate a number of benign logs that get hoovered up into this, like say a Splunk instance or some kind of SIM instance, so that you can look through the logs and most of what you're seeing is benign, because that's what we're often seeing in our production network environments. It helps the defenders start to look more realistically for the needles in the haystack. We also simulate traffic, web content, and then attacks. Attacks is really key because if we know who we're up against, then we sort of know what to prepare for. And so if we have specific APT attackers that have been targeting my industry vertical, I can actually simulate that here in an end-to-end threat scenario, all the way from initial access and spear phishing, all the way through to command and control and data exfiltration. And we can do that in this kind of controlled environment 17 times. Or we can run an atomic like Privesk 20 times, right? And we can train on this over and over and over again until our humans and our tools get better at detecting bad. If we don't do that, then we're just waiting for that bad day in cyber to happen in a production environment where everything's at risk: brand, reputation, time, energy, money. and so on. So this third layer, extremely key to making that network living and breathing and feel more real. And then the defensive sort of organizations in your security teams can obviously be laid in on top of this. Primarily, we support blue, red, and purple teams, given that we run Castle v Castle, blue v red, capture the flag events, but we can also help support security engineering, detection engineers, fine tuning and tweaking tools, DFIR, GRC, legal teams, right? So we can support a number of different security groups within the range environment that we build. And then ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, it's very important to be able to simulate your adversaries and ultimately train like you fight. Jason, I feel like given your background at both CrowdStrike and US Cyber Command, maybe you could kind of talk through some of the implications of training like this.
Yeah, I mean, think of it like this, right? I'll give you an example. Uh, when I was in basic training, I basically like we trained around a cardboard box. It didn't feel very real. Like we would like go into a building. It was made out of wood. There were like cutouts in the windows. Didn't really feel that real though, right? But then when we deployed, when we prepared to deploy, we actually went to a simulated city. This was actually a built-up city with real actors walking around, real bad guys. It was an entirely different experience. It just fundamentally felt different, right? And so sometimes like when I think about like a good simulated range, I think of it kind of like a city. Like imagine the network architecture layer, that's kind of like the buildings and the piping and the roads. The security stack is like the objects inside the building. It's like the desks and the chairs and the computers and the coffee machine or whatever. And then the realistic emulated activity is the actual people picking up the coffee, pouring the coffee, sitting in a chair. And now imagine what that city would be like if there was like no objects inside the building or no users actually doing stuff. That's kind of what training in the cyber realm is like when you don't have a real environment. It's like
Mhm.
you're going through the motions, you're checking the box, and like you're making yourself feel good and patting yourself on the back. But are you actually having like gaining any real benefit? And Susan, I'd love to hear your perspective on this because something that you've had the opportunity to kind of encounter from a SLED perspective is a lot of people taking these different training programs, but then being very disappointed in like the outcomes and not actually being able to translate that into real world like careers. So could you speak about that that little bit, like from your experience?
Sure, happy to. Thank you. So, yeah, what we've found is in academia in particular, students are graduating and they're not workforce ready. They theoretically know what to do, but they don't have the hands on. And that's where the sim space range comes into play. So, think about it like this. Um, I could give you a driver's ed manual and tell you to read about it and then come back in and speak to Graham and Jason, but we never give you the keys to the car. The hands on for the cyber range is really what the students need. And then when you look at state and local government, there's this ever changing situation in the state and local market where people are leaving private sector and they're going to public sector because they can make more money. So we see the range as being an opportunity to really motivate trainees to train and be proficient in their craft. Another thing I've noticed in the world of state and local government is SANS is something that a lot of folks have access to. They go to a SANS course. It's a week-long course. It's great. It's immersive. And then week 2, they slowly forget. Week 3, they slowly forget. Week 4. Whereas with the SimSpace range, you can be on the platform as often as you would like, and it can be as basic as one would hope or as comprehensive as you would need. So being able to have the ability to replicate your environment, embed test grid simulation. So it's a very, very robust platform.
Yeah, and what you noticed is both Jason and Susan have both brought metaphors to the table. People understand in story and metaphors. And so if you're listening to this, we keep trying to look at this from different perspectives because we're trying to help you understand quickly rather than saying big, fancy words. Another metaphor is you wouldn't send a soldier off to war, hand them a weapon, and say good luck. You want them to do close quarters combat. You want them to go to the range. You want them to put the gun together and take it apart and put it back together again and sort of get proficient at it. Or even to Jason's metaphor, be able to go into this sort of city and actually have sort of simulated rounds and get good. You wouldn't want to do that just with empty buildings and no one there, because then it's going to be bad outcomes when you actually go to war. If you don't like the war metaphor and that feels a little too aggressive, consider sports. Like you wouldn't go play a game without having first practice with like a team where they're wearing different jerseys or different pennies. You want to kind of simulate that environment and practice in that real thing so that you're ready for it. You wouldn't just sort of throw a few passes with football and then expect that you're going to win the game when you show up on game time. So we're just trying to drive home this concept of simulation as the future of the way that we train our workforces. We had talked about how we could also pull in real devices, and I wanted to foot stomp that, given that it's very important that the organizations that we work for often have things that either can't be simulated or are sort of tricky to train on. And that's often where we get into this operational technology, supervisory control, and data acquisition type elements. And so here you're looking at how we've successfully brought a gas turbine combined cycle integrated into the range, a simulator of a chem plant, or even HMI PLC for a feed water treatment. And they're all in sort of different OT subnets. Right. So think about if you're familiar with looking at network topologies, this will be quickly familiar to you. If you're not, basically you're looking at sort of an edge router where there's an external red team subnet if you wanted to create, your own attackers. There's an external simulated or real internet segment where you can have external folks coming in and out of this range. And then everything south of this edge router is where this sort of organization that we're protecting lives. And so you can see a DMZ, a server subnet, a number of different kind of user endpoint subnets and OT subnets as well, some of them behind firewalls. So this is just an example template of a range that we can set up to be able to train for OT specific attack patterns. Notice that I set up here in the upper right-hand corner that Modbus protocol, if you've never heard of it, is often the protocol that we're having to train on. Because when you get into interacting with these HMIs and PLCs, the way that bad guys sort of are able to get in and manipulate those things is through that insecure kind of Modbus protocol. And it's been around for 30, 40 years. Moving into more the current state of use cases, a way to think about this is sort of like how mature your organization is, how mature your workforce is, how sort of what your goals are and where you want to get. And a number of these elements we can accommodate using the SimSpace platform. So it's not just that we're doing live fire exercises within a cyber range. We can do a lot of other things with it. Jason, did you want to expand on this particular slide?
Well, yeah, I mean, like going back to like the idea of what would you do if you could like what would you be willing to go through if doing that could help you understand the future? The more you think about that, the more there's a variety of different use cases. And so, for example, we have a couple of clients who use SimSpace to do detection engineering. Rather than try to figure out the answer on their own, they run the simulations inside our environment. They emulated basically their infrastructure, and they're able to use those emulations to speed up the detection engineering process. I was actually talking to one of our partners who was doing like an independent study on this earlier today, and they said that one of our customers that they talked to was able to speed up the detection engineering process by 3 to 4 months on average. And so, like, just think about what that means in terms of like the amount of FTEs that you're saving, the amount of time that you're saving. And again, that's only one application, right? Like, we have a customer who's using SimSpace or who's considering using SimSpace to create a deception lab, which for those of you who aren't familiar with it, cyber deception is like you create a simulated environment that looks like you with the intent of having adversaries attack it. So instead of them attacking your real network, they're actually attacking the simulated network. And so it's like you get the first mover advantage. You get to see what they're doing in a simulated environment before they actually come and hold your real environment at risk. And so what I like about it, and one of the reasons I came to this company is it's kind of like it's up to your imagination. Like whatever use cases you can imagine through simulation, yes, you can do that. And so that's been really a really cool thing for me, like so far being here.
Well said. Well said. There was a question that came up, and I don't mind taking questions live as we move through. Susan, it has to do with how SimSpace stacks up against other cyber range competitors. I know, given that you have sort of transitioned over, would you be willing to talk about some of the differentiations from your perspective?
Sure, happy to. So yeah, I have about almost 7 years of experience in the cyber range space and over 20 in cybersecurity. So What I would say is the thing that makes SimSpace different and unique is you have the ability to bring your own content in. If you're a faculty member, for example, you can build your own content. They want academic freedom to be able to build what they want when they want. So I would say that's a key differentiator. SCADA capabilities within the range is really important. So if you think about a student and you're looking at it from an academic standpoint of view, which institution out there is really geared toward taking a student that's going through a cybersecurity degree and then going to work for like an Exxon or Eversource or what have you. SCADA systems can be complicated. In many cases, they are just as critical as, straight up IT systems. So I would say that there are other ranges that have low level content, very static content. It's like walking down the sidewalk. It's point A, point B, point B, point C. It's very, very static. Ours is, as Graham and Jason mentioned, very, very immersive. And if I was to want to learn, which someday I'd love to, Spanish, I think I would go to Spain and immerse myself in the culture because that's going to allow for me to learn more rapidly. So yeah, lots of different ranges out there. There are some that are really meant just for low-level labs. But at the end of the day, organizations want folks that have gone through ransomware attacks using Splunk, for example. They have a handle on going through an EDR and working with the CrowdStrike platform, for example. And those things should be items that should be placed on resumes for graduating students today.
Yeah. Said simply, our biggest differentiators is we are the most customizable range on the market. And so if you want to bring your own tools, great. If you want us to build ranges for you, great. If you want to learn how to build your own range, great. If you want to create your own custom training labs, sure. If you want to duplicate ours and personalize them to your environment, you can do that, as well as pull in any device and any security related application. Which actually is a nice segue into one of the case studies we wanted to discuss today. So SimSpace won a very large contract with the state of Florida, or the state of Florida, I should say. But the Cyber Florida implications being that we also support a number of universities and some of the state and local elements. And so you can see here what the overall kind of approach has been is how can we develop our existing staff? How can we help with candidate assessments for prospective folks starting to work for the state or local elements or even schools within the state of Florida? And we've already done a number of tabletop exercises, technical simulations, and range exercises to include plugging in with the National Guard and county sheriff's offices that have really driven this home from a statewide perspective. Notice also that we have developed IT and OT specific exercises. So we're not just sort of saying that it's possible to pull in OT, we're actually doing it on a municipal and critical infrastructure level for the state of Florida. Susan, I know that you have supported a number of states in the past. Did you have any kind of thoughts or comments about, maybe the lessons we've learned from Cyber Florida that some of the folks listening could take away?
That's a great question. I would say I've had the good fortune to work with many, many states across the US and Canada. What I've found is Cyber Florida is extremely engaging, right? They are extremely engaging and they genuinely care about the work that they're doing. They really want to be the pinnacle of all states, and they are training a lot of the agencies. They're now extending into academia. I've seen other states where, the state of South Carolina has gotten funding for another institution where they've been funded for a cyber range. Massachusetts went through a cyber trust consortium where they got funding from the Commonwealth of Mass, and they're standing up access to different students where they can go ahead and go through different exercises. North Dakota, interesting state. They're very, very hands-on, doing a lot of crisis simulation work, running live fire exercises. South Dakota, not so much. So every state's taking a different approach, but we really need to get there. And I think that we as a country, if we could start to collaborate more and share more across state and local government, that would be absolutely phenomenal.
Thank you. Throughout a given year, especially when we're supporting states, local, even federal, you can see that we're often bringing students together in sort of semi-annual, quarterly, or monthly capstone type events. And so You can see from the pictures how folks are interacting with the cyber range, how you can sort of put up some of the range deployments and the networks that we're working with and start to track how well we're doing. We even have things called defender logs, which is our ability to interpret what we see. So similar to the way you would put in a ticket in Jira, ServiceNow, or Splunk Phantom, you could capture how the SOC operators are viewing and identifying malicious activity. So you can see here a number of quarterly platform and content type updates. So we're always making those faster, more applicable to recent threat scenarios and increasing our ability to provide realism. And then you can see a number of these events often have sort of a familiarization session, what we call a FAM session, how you can kind of prep your control cell and your white team. And then you can run a red v blue, you can run a purple team, and then you do some kind of debrief, hot wash, after action report where we start to determine how well did we do? What was the defensive success rate? What was the threat dwell time? How well were we appropriately using best practices? So just interesting ways to continue to develop your team dynamics. A number of other ways in which we can do that is training within what we call the live action events. So if you wanted to pull in a team of forensics analysts or incident responders without having to run a full-blown red v blue, you can do that as well. And we can create automated attacks like APT 29, 37, and 41, which will run within this environment with both emulated users and your security tools. The way we do that is actually automated threats. It says SAP here, but simply stands for SimSpace Automated Attack Platform. Said another way, attack emulation. Bronze Butler, you can see over here, I believe it's APT 31. It is a group that was targeting in Asia and East Asia with extreme complexity. So a very highly sophisticated attack pattern. It takes about 20 minutes to run. And on the right-hand side, you can see how this threat is emanating from our in-range Chimera attack server, which shows off how many actions were taken to ultimately get initial access with zero-day emulation, launch out into one of the user subnets, enumerate users, escalate privileges, move laterally into another user subnet, and then beacon back for data exfiltration. This would be available as a sort of monitoring dashboard for event managers or control cell elements while a red v blue live fire exercise is ongoing. Another example of some of these exercises in more of a larger scale is the Adriatic Cyber Exercise, which we ran this year in July over in Eastern Europe. And so you can see how a number of National Guard units actually teamed up with countries in Eastern Europe to see how well they would do together, also further simulating how well teams interact with each other. And you might be surprised by this, or maybe not, that one of the primary outcomes for running these exercises, go figure, people don't communicate very well. And so we identify the gaps in how we're interacting with each other. Sometimes what we'll see is we have multiple sort of shoulder surf and watch some of the players trying to detect malicious activity. And 3 or 4 of them will be looking at the same thing without realizing it. So they're all sort of looking for the same binaries. They're all, no one's reported it yet, but we're just wasting time and cycles not having communicated clearly a line of effort, who's doing what, and reporting back to HQ, so to speak. We've also done Cyber Shield over in Europe. Again, very large network implementations. This one was 30 networks, 500 people, 3,500 VMs across 2 weeks. So very, very large range implementations, but can of course scale down to even a biz medium with or biz mini with 50 VMs and the ability to train 5 people if you'd like. Another joint training element, I think Jason probably is most suited to talk to this, just given your background in Cyber Command.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about how reality rarely actually plays out, it's never just like one team doing something, right? It is a joint fight. It is a joint effort. And so when you think about the United States, it's defense in depth. So like the national mission teams in cybercom have certain types of authorities to be able to do things like, for example, offensive operations that maybe Wells Fargo would not. Whereas the New York City Cyber Command has a responsibility of defending a municipality, and maybe Wells Fargo is a single financial institution, financial entity inside that municipality. And so there's the idea of jointness as well when it comes to cyber range simulations. And how do we take players from different organizations who in real life need to cooperate with each other, but rarely have the opportunity to practice together against a joint threat? And so I think that's kind of the premise here. It's like, again, going back to the idea of why we do this. We do this because we don't want to face these harsh scenarios in real life for the first time without having practice. And so what I love about this example is it's literally taking different entities, one from the private sector, one from a municipality, and then one at a national level, and then kind of forcing them to really think through like, okay, if this were real life, who exactly would do what? Who defends what? Who does the command and control? And so that's like, I think, another really cool outcome of like what we can enable.
Agreed. And just for any clarity for those watching, in the bottom right-hand corner, PCTE stands for the Persistent Cyber Training Environment for U.S. Cyber Command, which has the SimSpace Cyber Range under the hood. I think the next element I'd like to show is actually just to jump ahead to our consolidated afloat network. So if you're listening and you're more on the military federal side of things, we have also deployed on-prem simulators and cyber ranges anywhere in the world. And so this does not have to be something that's hidden in the cloud or in a SaaS-based platform. This can be something that you can even implement air-gapped. So that if you have something even like a destroyer in this particular case, we are able to still capture what that network and range looks like and continue to train from wherever we are. I think this is also incredibly important for us to know how to understand if our attackers are sort of coming at us and we don't want them to understand our network topologies. We can deploy that into an on-prem instance that's completely obfuscated and separate from anything else. So there's no potential issue with that touching PII, your production network in any way. It can be completely siphoned off to the point where we've sometimes even deployed SimSpace cyber ranges onto a kit. So a flyaway kit or something as small as a Pelican case, which can contain the entire kind of firepower of this simulation engine without needing it to be plugged in anywhere that could be compromised or known. Moving into from kind of current state to emerging use cases, we find ourselves again at the kind of modern cyber range setup. And not sure if you had any thoughts here specifically, Jason, but just to double click on, we walked through a number of the kind of municipal, local, state, federal, military use cases. That remains the same for how we consider simulating the future.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to the next slide, I think this is one way to articulate it. Going back to the premise, if only we could know what was going to happen in the future, we would be that much better prepared. And I would argue that logic really applies with not only security disciplines, but also the idea to achieve cost savings, things like change management, things like training. And so what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to test different things before the adversary has the chance to do that. And I think like part of the challenge is like, particularly from like a defense and offense point of view, the adversary gets the first mover advantage. But what we're seeing a lot of our customers do is instead of just allowing the adversary to have that first mover advantage and allow them to just do whatever they want without, trying to get ahead of them, they're simulating these possible negative outcomes to see what might be possible in order to get ahead of the adversary. So for example, we had one customer who validated their zero trust capabilities in their identity and access management program through our range to see what are all the different ways it could be defeated. I already said earlier that we have customers who are using it for threat detection, for detection engineering, and getting ahead of the adversary's ability to use new and bespoke attacks. We talked about the customer who's using it for cyber deception. In fact, we even have customers who, instead of just making a buying decision, what do? They simulate the buying decision first. And so simulate your environment, simulate your infrastructure, see what happens if you buy this EDR vendor versus that EDR vendor, or this firewall versus that firewall. And so these are just some of the use cases that we've been seeing. But then what we're also going to talk about as we go through these next few slides is some of the possible use cases and some of the emerging ones that we think some of our more advanced customers are about to leverage as well.
Right. And I did want to, reinforce how important that sort of detection engineering, even procurement and bake-off element is as well. So a number of our customers will actually deploy in these EDRs and compare them against each other and say, okay, do I want, and imagine for commercial off-the-shelf tools, we don't even really understand how long it's going to take for us to set up, instantiate those, and actually like get those up and running. Could take months, right? And another tool could take days, and that's a non-trivial amount of time. So what we can do is sort of simulate that and see, oh wow, okay, maybe we do want to go with this other tool because this is going to be easier to implement and has more overall detections off the shelf. Or maybe with the detection engineering use case, we can start to kind of fine tune and tweak some of those tools to make sure that we have rules to detect things beyond what it's capable of, right, off the shelf or out of the box. You can see here continuous red team attack emulations being an important element. We do have our own autonomous and automated attacks, as we showed earlier, but we often run those in parallel with live red teams. And so if you have a red team at your organization, you can bring that. If you'd like the SimSpace professional services team to bring ours, we can deploy them globally. Preemptive insider threats is another interesting kind of use case. Jason, did you want to unpack that one just a little bit more?
Sure, yeah. And this is an idea that Graham and I were talking about during my early time with the company. And so think about the problem of insider threats. There's a lot of problems, but the two problems that really stand out the most to me, one is that they're inside, right? You trust them, and so you're not going to really kind of like engage in like overbearing security measures against that individual. But then at the same time, it's like, well, yeah, how do I detect these insiders? Right now, the current state is, well, let's give them like risk ranked scoring. Let's do user behavior analytics. Oh, they got in trouble at work. Okay, now they have a slightly higher score. And yet, regardless of some of these methodologies, there's still a pretty significant insider threat, not only from the perspective of the insider, but also the perspective of ransomware operators who are collaborating with insiders in order to allow them access. And so one of the things that Graham and I thought through was, well, why don't we simulate an insider threat? Why not create a replica of the customer's environment? And instead of trying to find ways to monitor on real people, let's create the simulated insider threat, have them go through like 20 to 30 different permutations of how they could execute an insider threat, and then use that for insider user behavior analytics detection engineering. And so I like that example because it's one of the most far out ones, right? Because I'm not aware of anybody doing that right now. But again, it's like, well, we have all this technology. We have the ability to simulate these ranges. AI is becoming more and more powerful. So how can we combine these different resources in order to combat some of the advanced problems that are holding customers at risk today?
Yes, yes. And one key one moving into our first use case here is actually the historical example that happened this year. So imagine being able to test patches and updates to your software stack before pushing it into production. I mean, you would think that this surely is the kind of thing that we're going to do by default. A lot of people don't. And so a faulty CrowdStrike software update, as you likely heard in the news, caused significant disruption across the market, but more specifically in the case of an airline organization, it cost them a significantly more, sort of amount of money, reputation, operating loss, just given their overall exposure to this particular update. These are the kind of happenings that's really important for us to look at and say, what are our lessons learned so that we can implement and erect new defenses against this happening again. And one of our propositions is that using a SimSpace cyber range to test updates prior to pushing them into production can find things like this. Fine, you want to crash the range? Great. At least we're not crashing the production environment. Another element here was the kind of airfield. And this is simply a network topology expansion of, like, let's imagine that this airline organization wasn't just compromised with their IT systems. Let's imagine that their OT systems were shut down and compromised as well. So here we have an airfield control room. We have a fuel farm simulator that would help certainly gauge how well some of the planes are being fueled and refueled, and then the ability to kind of monitor all of those different nodes. We've intentionally introduced vulnerabilities into this range so that you can test that and train for that kind of bad day in cyber. But imagine, again, even a software update, seemingly a benign, relatively positive thing, could cause severe disruption and outage to these systems as well. And we just want to know that before it actually happens to the ones operating in the real world. It's almost like business as usual is what we're aiming for, but the way that we identify that prior to impacting is in a simulator. Our second use case covers cloud security in a hybrid workforce. As organizations transition from the traditional on-premise setups to more of a hybrid or even cloud, 100% cloud architecture using primary CSPs like GCP, Azure, or AWS, it's important for us to know how exposed some of these municipal utility providers are, given specific cyber threats. Perhaps, Jason, you had some more thoughts on this particular use case?
Yeah, I mean, let's go to the next slide, and I can kind of characterize it there. And then, Susan, I'd love to get some of your more practical experience, like working with cities to solve some of this. And so, like, when I think about what is literally the most complicated environment that I can conceive of, honestly, it would kind of be a city. Like, think about where you live and think about all the interacting systems that you sort of just take for granted. Traffic lights, take for granted, water pipes, roadways, electricity, emergency services, so on and so forth. It all kind of just works, right? But the truth is, it doesn't all kind of just work. There are a lot of hardworking people who are constantly troubleshooting problems, constantly scrambling. There's constant attacks. And I know it said on the last slide, but like the amount of nation state and criminal attacks against utilities entities continues to skyrocket. And unfortunately, these are the types of entities where if they get hit and they go down, it doesn't just impact that particular entity, it impacts all of us. And not just from a financial standpoint, but from a health and human safety standpoint. And so I might sound like a broken record, but like, yeah, let's simulate it first. Simulate what would happen if certain types of attacks were to occur. If a certain substation were to go down, okay, how does that actually affect the rest of the grid? What do those dependencies look like? And so for me, that's the more powerful, that's one of the more powerful ideas around how to use this software or this capability, not just for, not just for like, obviously for the cybersecurity benefit, but for also the benefit of maintaining the capacity to support utilities to society. Susan, what's been your experience in this area?
I think that what happens quite often is when there is a breach at the state and local level, it's very, very difficult for agencies to recover quickly because they're lean on talent. And other things come to the forefront in terms of priority. Quite often, it's just a function of they just don't have enough time to dig in and get the work done to really isolate what's been happening. You have folks that are, doing double time, right? Like they're an incident responder, but they're also doing other things within a state and local government. So we're seeing, critical infrastructure attacks on water systems. We do know that there was a law back in several years ago where state and local entities were required to do certain things from a critical infrastructure standpoint of view. And again, because of resources, many are not in compliance. I do believe, though, that there are entities that are really starting to take training more seriously to be sure that they're, protecting their environments and protecting, the different agencies across their states. There's also been a fair amount of collaboration state to state, where in some cases they'll start to share what they're seeing from a state and local standpoint of view, which is really nice. There are different conferences that I've seen folks at, NASIO in particular, where you'll hear a lot of collaboration where the different states will be like, hey, I'm deploying this. What do you think about that? How can we help one another to become more efficient?
And I think about something I heard a few years back where bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. And we talked earlier about how there's hard cost to money, there's soft cost to reputation, but what about the human cost? And so Jason brought up a really interesting point that there's lives at stake here, especially when we're talking about ICS and utilities and critical infrastructure. And state and local organizations are a significant part of that overall ecosystem. So let's again consider how we can get out in front of these threats that are coming. Think about adversarial AI and how fast our cyber threat sort of actors are able to rapidly expand their capabilities and start to improve their overall attack patterns and methods. In order to keep pace with or outpace them, we need to simulate those kind of attacks.
So Graham, if I'm a state and local entity, how easy is it for that entity to take customized content out of the box and make it more specific to a particular state agency?
So quite easy. We have a couple different ways in which you could do that. So we have individual training content where you can take the pen and content author anything you'd like or personalize existing content that we have, including on ICS elements that are useful for the organizations you mentioned. We also can train folks on how to craft networks that look like them, or we can simply build ranges that look like those environments. So it's very easy to edit and extend the way in which we emulate those network topologies and can pull in students, candidates, operators, CISOs, legal teams, all in the same place.
So can you speak to a little bit about multi-tenancy? Because if I'm a state agency and I'm Department of Motor Vehicles, I really don't want my data being, seen by the folks over in Health and Human Services. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because there's that big brother concern that's out there.
Yeah, the SimSpace platform is role-based access control and multi-tenant, as well as SSO, of course. But the multi-tenant piece is important because if we are an upper level kind of parent org with multiple kind of child suborgs, we can set that up within the same space platform such that they're correctly sectioned off. So it's very easy to kind of toggle between some of those outputs, but the ranges would not be able to see each other. So yeah, in the case of Cyber Florida, for example, we have multiple higher level organizations and suborgs that are stacked neatly underneath them without being able to see each other.
Awesome.
Leading into our final use case here on enhancing cybersecurity decision making, we had talked briefly about this from a CISO or a deputy CISO point of view. Imagine being able to make better decisions on the tools that you are about to procure or your existing stack to really focus on the scalpels and sort of leave the rest. But what about, even insurance? If we're going to make decisions about how much money to spend on our security budget, on how well we need to prepare for the next threat and not the last one, sometimes we do have to take a philosophy of like, if breaches do come in, how much chaos are they going to cause, and what is our overall kind of plan for mitigation? This is where we get into insurance policies and premiums, where if we get hit by ransomware, can we restore from backup? Can we ameliorate some of the losses by defraying the cost with this cyber insurance premium? And one of the ways that our customers will do that is they will run quarterly exercises in order to drive down their insurance premiums to their provider. So if you're able to meaningfully say that between January and July, and between July and December, I've reduced threat dwell time by 32%, increased my best practices rate by 35%, and increased my defensive success rate by 20-30%, which is your ability to detect bad, then you're able to make a justification and a great argument to negotiate down those overall premiums because you're more ready for a bad day in cyber. You still have protection, but you're not needing to spend as much up front. I'll leave it open to any on my side for additional context here. Okay. To kind of foot stomp this, imagine being able to compare your stack. So you can see here, CrowdStrike, Palo Alto, SentinelOne. What if we could add in our security tools in our stack? The logos and the tools that you would expect. Be able to run these automated attacks and start to get the numbers for them. Because how else do you make decisions about your existing stack if you don't have any sort of meaningful numbers to base those decisions off of? So you can see here, a recall of attack scenarios, mean time to first detection, precision, recall, true positives, false positives. We need to understand how well our tools are doing in order to focus on the right ones, procure new ones, and continue to kind of move the needle upward. And this is obviously based on the risk appetite for our specific organization. And you may have like a more risk-prone CISO. But what you want to be able to do is really understand how well the patchwork quilt of security tools is protecting my organization from harm. And this is the future of not only the SimSpace platform, but again, the simulation industry writ large. As we near the end of our presentation, I just wanted to touch on a number of final elements. So individual skills assessment and training is certainly one way that we can do this. So setting aside live fire exercises and even comparing our tool stack, we also can start to baseline our security defenders. We can create structured training for upskilling our elite defenders. We can train on new and emerging threats. We can create candidate assessments before we hire anyone, and instead of trusting the paper, see how well they do within a cyber range environment and how good at threat hunting they actually are. We can also do range simulations, as I mentioned, to drive down those premiums. But imagine being able to track it at this level of statistical significance, being able to track elements over time in an after-action report that you can provide up to the board, provide to the GRC and legal team, or provide to an insurance provider. We can also generate a takeaway and a report and an executive summary for a number of the leaders across the organization so that they have an understanding of where are we at today and what's coming. So why SimSpace? I think we face a number of the what ifs and the hypothetical every day. This is about driving home the fact that, to Susan's point earlier, we can take a week-long course and we will slowly but surely continue to forget the things that we learned on pen and paper. But what we won't get the opportunity to do is try that and practice it every single day. Practice and train for the real thing. Jason or Susan, you may have additional thoughts here, but did you want to touch on sort of the sophistication of our platform in order to address those kind of what ifs?
I mean, for me, it ultimately comes down to the same message. You will face a threat. The reason that you're in cybersecurity is because you acknowledge that it's going to happen. And the only question left to answer is how do you want it to happen, right? It's going to happen. So how will it be? Will you face it the first time when you get there, or will you at least have some level of preparation? And it almost doesn't matter what the scenario is, whether it's vulnerability management or you're a SOC analyst or you're an incident response or you're an insider threat professional. If you are a threat professional, then you do it because you are preparing for the day that will one day inevitably come. And so for me, that's the underlying message. It's like, how can we more easily do this? How can you more regularly prepare? Not only from a personnel perspective, but even as Graham showed on one of the previous slides, like how do we prepare technology? How do we make sure that we're making the right decisions in that area as well? And so there's really nothing that can't be served by at least simulating it and trying it through in some type of protected, safe environment.
That's right. And providing, various tools, lookalike kits, electrical grids, hydro pumps, industrial control systems equipment, and doing that not only in a SaaS-based environment out of our data center in Boston and Frankfurt, but also on-prem, air-gapped, hyper-converged, and implemented however you'd like. So really, to drive this home again, I just wanted to surface this slide from earlier, that at the end of the day, if you can take what we're talking about at the smallest atomic level, we're talking about the ability to simulate the future and make optimized decisions about our security stack and our risk. And we do that by building from the kind of network architecture layer from your production networks all the way up into these various use cases, but making sure that we think about your tools, your users, your attackers, with no PII and no risk, but with quite a bit of reward. And at the end of the day, we're not waiting for the fight to come to us. We are learning in an environment that helps us really be prepared for that fight. With that, I'll turn it over for any questions from the audience. We're happy to stay a few minutes over as well to expand on any answers. Thank you.
Seeing a question here, Graham. What is possible to simulate with a SimSpace cyber range?
Yeah, well, as you heard earlier, that there aren't really limitations to what we are able to emulate. What I would answer is like this is an iterative process, and so if we start at 50% with a network that looks like you, we can continue to iterate. Okay, what about that tool? What about that service? What about adding that specific APT threat? And that's how we build alongside our customers. I also want to make clear that it's often we're talking about an approximation of reality. So if you have a huge network of 100,000 endpoints, we don't need 100,000 endpoints to successfully emulate a range. It's not hard. We're talking about complex, but it can be easy. For example, if I had 10 user endpoints or even 100, I could still generate the activity of 100,000, generating 30, 50, 100 million logs a day within these ranges without having to have an overly complicated range environment. So anything is the short answer, but also we can make it easy, manageable, and an approximation of reality to make sure that it's at scale.
And we also have an excellent customer success team that works with you to customize learning paths, learning journeys, and they'll work with you on project plans to be sure that we're meeting your timeline, your expectations. And we subscribe to the philosophy of crawl, walk, run, do it right, do it well. And that seems to work really, really well. But we have some great engineering resources, excellent customer success people that can help you as well.
Seeing
Thanks.
another question here. Can you talk about how SimSpace ensures its platform remains like secure and capable of handling classified or sensitive data?
Yeah, and that touches on my point earlier is that if that is of any kind of concern, we can implement on-prem and even air-gapped to the point, and we've done that with military installations at the unclassed, secret, and top secret levels. So we've been down that path many times, and we can absolutely do that. As far as our SaaS-based portal, it is demarcated, and we protect that data because we own that data center. And so we're not dependent upon other cloud service providers, which allows us to have even more control over the data and its integrity. We're also SOC 2 Type 1 and moving toward a number of other frameworks and industry standards for data confidentiality.